Hi there, this is Paul Carrigan here with Dr. Timothy Oleksiak, an assistant professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and author, among other things, of two essays that are just out that we're going to talk about today on slow peer review, a queer praxis for peer review in 3Cs, college composition and communication, and slow peer review in the writing classroom in pedagogy. I think I held those up inversely. In these two essays, he presents a theory of peer review, student-to-student peer review, and practice that he calls slow peer review, which is a new, different way of approaching that traditional classical strategy of having students swap drafts and talk to each other about how to improve them. So slow peer review does have students swap drafts, but ask them to spend a lot more time with those drafts than usual, reading them very carefully and thinking very deeply about them. And then asks them to respond in different and more in-depth ways than just hear some suggestions. So I found these essays really compelling, opening so many questions with relevance, I think, far beyond that specific activity and far beyond the teaching of writing. So I think this conversation and these essays will be useful to teachers in a lot of contexts. So Timothy, thanks for being here with me. And the first thing that I want to ask you, which will tie into a question later, is tell us something about yourself as a person that we wouldn't know from reading your scholarship.
I love that. First of all, thank you for agreeing to talk with me about this. I was talking with a friend and a close friend of mine, and she said, "What are you most afraid of?" And one of my things that came to my mind is that my colleagues who I respect in the field would not take my work seriously. And so I feel like, just being here is an indication that my work is valued. I hope that doesn't sound arrogant or whatnot, but it's rare to be asked to do these things. And I'm really honored that you asked me and invited me here. So thank you. So about me, that my work necessarily wouldn't tell people. In some of my bios, I put I'm an opera lover. I love opera. Philip Glass is someone that is like core. My fangirl status for Philip Glass is a part of my identity. I actually got to shake his hand once, and I was just like, I understood immediately why people sometimes cry at pop concerts. It was a lived experience with one of my idols. So yeah, I really appreciate opera, and what I've come to understand about it is it's the only art form that gives me a sense of timelessness every time I experience it. So I've sat in front of great paintings, I've watched really lovely plays and been to musicals, but it's only been opera where no matter what the opera, I'll sit down in the seat and there's this sense of losing myself in place and time. And that's just a magical moment that's only realized when you snap back into it, right? So it's not a conscious choice to leave. It's just a sudden awareness that you have been gone. And there's something really fantastic about that. Yeah. So this is a little bit about me.
Oh, I love that. And your comments on timelessness then I think makes your answer tie into several things I want to ask you about. The kind of launching point, or one launching point for your 3Cs essay, the Queer Praxis for Peer Review, is this critique of the improvement imperative. It strikes me that the idea that everything in a writing classroom wouldn't be directed towards making the writing better would be heretical to a lot of teachers, right? Like, isn't that what we're here for? And if I'm reading you right, you're not saying let's not help students get their writing better. You're saying there are also other important things we can be doing, and here's a chance for one of them.
I think that's right. I think that's right, in two senses. One, that to give up our seeming reason for being, which is to improve student writing, it does seem heretical, right? I also think that, yes, you're right. There are more things to do in the writing classroom, and writing does, and talking about writing does more than lead us to improvement. It changes, it transforms. Writing is designed to, from a rhetorical perspective, is designed to change others and to be changed ourselves and so improvement is not antithetical to change. It's just improvement signals a certain kind of change, which carries with it particular modes of relationality. And it's that notion of improvement as a relationship that I'm really suspicious of, if I could use this. And the C's article tries to track out a little bit of that suspicion for why is it that improvement is the only way that we're able to think about peer review. And that's a grand claim, that's a big claim. There are other ways of thinking about peer review, but by and large, in the readings that I've done, it seems that peer review's end goal is based on improvement. And I want to imagine and think about peer review having other motivating factors or other kind of ways into that practice that aren't animated by those logics and that form of relationality. Yeah.
Thank you. You kind of related to that improvement imperative. You apply the concept of cruel optimism, which is just it's a beautifully poetic phrase. But specifically, you say that you kind of make the observation, and I've experienced this, and I think a lot of other people are, that we try to get students to swap drafts and help each other, and like it doesn't always work. And you say, I think on 213, that like if we have this idea that just if we just did it better, like if we just tweak it, if we implemented it better, if we designed a better structure for it, but it doesn't work because it doesn't work, and not because we're not doing it good enough. Right. And so I just really think that like being able to say that about a thing is really helpful. But I'm wondering then, I guess my question about cruel optimism has two parts. Is one, like, couldn't that apply to everything in education? Because like, what is working? There's so many things that are not working, and we're constantly trying to make it better about everything. So I guess one, how broadly is this, in your view, concept of cruel optimism applicable? And then part two, at the end of the pedagogy version, which is shorter and more less theoretical in that it's here's some examples and then the others here's some theory. That's oversimplifying, but you end that essay by saying essentially we're going to try and there's hope, and the best we can just do is try our best and keep trying. And so I guess you do end with the word hope, but I think I paraphrased that other part. So I guess the second part of my question is, what distinguishes cruel optimism from hope, from trying to do better because that's what we got to do. We got to try to do better.
Oh man, these are really good questions. So let me take it one at a time. I think that first of all, Lauren Berlant coined the term and wrote a book called Cruel Optimism. And Lauren Berlant operates in queer theory, queer literary studies, and cultural studies in affect. She's aligned with affect theorists. And so that book, she's talking about the ways we attach to certain objects, that it's a process of attachment to those objects. So when I heard that, and here's how it relates to peer review. So peer review promises certain things. In the C's article, I suggest that peer review promises improvement. It's animated by, if we engage peer review, improvement will result. But as any writing teacher soon experiences, that doesn't always work. And so the promise of peer review is consistently and repeatedly deferred. It doesn't follow through. Student work isn't improved, or that whatever it is we want peer review to accomplish doesn't happen. And what makes it even worse is that sometimes when it does, it like we dig into it, right? And so the exception is like, oh, we almost got it, so let's keep doing it. And she's talking about dieting and drugs and cruel optimism. And I'm suggesting that like maybe some of the ways in which we engage with peer review function a lot like cruel optimism, that we cling to it, hoping to get it better, even though it's consistently deferred. And that keeps us stuck in these affective relationships to it. Some people just are like, I don't know what to do with peer review, but it seems like a really important feature in our writing classrooms, to the extent where some teachers have abandoned the practice and don't do peer review. But I think the vast majority of rhetoric and composition faculty still try to do peer review. And yet there's always this element of unsatisfying kind of thing. And the notion of cruel optimism then is calling attention to the trying and trying again and not getting any better at it. And so you'll get a lot, and especially in the 80s, you'll get a lot of scholarship that shows up, like, here's what peer review looks like in my classroom, But when you look at it all, it's still animated by these same deferred promises. And so whether or not that cruel optimism is applicable to other aspects of our field, I think it is. I'm trying in my work to focus on this particular thing. So if there's a larger field indictment or a field challenge, to be more kind, or a moment of transition, then it may be there. I think so. If I think about the field in its entirety, as a non-tenured, tenure track scholar who's trying to produce work that circulates, I want to focus on peer review though. I want to focus on this particular practice, largely because though there is peer review scholarship being produced on the regular, it's often in the TESOL journals, in like multilingual pedagogies, and in other things. The last peer review in C's, 3 C's, I can't remember exactly when it was. There was an edited collection called Peer Pressure, Peer Persuasion. Oh, it's right here. Peer Pressure, Peer Power. That's really fantastic. And that was in 2014. So it's not like we're not producing scholarship. It's just that the engagement, deep down engagement into like the whole fundamental reason for peer review, I want to queer that. It's really important to me as a queer scholar to bring in queer thinking in these practices. And I didn't see much of that. I don't want to make the claim like I'm the first to do this, because I don't think I am. But bringing in theories of rhetorical listening with queer theory into peer review and trying to think through that as a world-making practice seems like a novel approach. At least I hope it is, and I hope it's generative for the field. But so I'm really interested right now in my life to like keep it focused on peer review, even though that concept of cruel optimism is super generative, and scholars who are interested in it and see it in like grammar instruction, for example. What's the cruel attachments we have to that? A lot of times we come at grammar instruction through anti-racist pedagogies and things like that. And that's important in super generative work. Could it also be that we're stuck in a relationship of cruel attachment to standard edited white English that is in addition to white supremacists clinging on to the thing? Not that white supremacist logics and cruel optimism are separate, but like we come at it through perhaps different concepts. So I think that the cruel optimism should float around rhetoric and composition more. And it is. I'm not the first one to bring cruel optimism. Gavin Johnson has done work with that concept in his dissertation. Jonathan Alexander and David Wallace have also used it. There's a couple of other folks that are working with cruel optimism. So now, what is the relationship between hope and cruel optimism? I think if we're gonna center, it's how we form our relationships. It's how we attach to an object. It's not that we attach to an object. That's a really important distinction. And so we can't throw out the object because that might cause too much trauma, that might cause too much damage, and that actually doesn't fix things because most people aren't gonna let go of their attachments to peer review. And so to say, well, just don't do it is sidestepping the issue. So how do we take the basic features of draft, share, engage, and revise and form different attachments to it? I think that when our attachments to a particular practice can focus on the worlds that get created and the effects of those relationships in peer review and beyond, that feels like the kind of hope and attachment that is not cruelly determined. So one of the things that I think slow peer review is trying to do is move from the focus on texts to their effects. From the focus on a document, a thing that's created, to the world it imagines people inhabiting. And if we start to think through texts or drafts, I'm talking about drafts as the primary text in peer review relationship. If we start to think of these drafts as creating forms of relationships, creating worlds that others can inhabit or not inhabit, then we're after a more generative, realistic relationship to peer review than if it's just this kind of improvement inflected peer review. One is cruel attachment. The other, I think, is something more hopeful, more pragmatic. Does that make sense? And it requires a lot of conceptual shifts, I think, in the language and the conversation about peer review. And these two articles particularly are really just gestures at beginning these conceptual shifts. And I wanted to, as a queer feminist thinker, I wanted to give space for a queer peer review and then a feminist practice of slow peer review and how that might look. But they're all animated on understanding drafts as an assertion about who can live and who can't live in the world that is created, and the relationships that get formed when we talk about those worlds. I'm really excited and hopeful about that as a way to talk about peer review, that when you give me a text for my review, that you are giving me a world that you and I can live in, and then people who we can't even imagine can also live in. That's part of the queer world, is that it's bigger, as Warner and Berlant talk about, a world is bigger than public because it includes all those we can't imagine. So drafts build worlds. Drafts make cases for who can and cannot thrive and survive. And I want to sensitize students at all levels, and even our colleagues, to when you get a draft, you are getting an argument for who can participate. And the author is part of that world, and you as the reviewer are part of that world. And how do we treat each other with love and respect for the world that is being created? And treating each other with love and respect is not an obfuscation of your desires and your vision for worlds. So for example, in the pedagogy article, we have Gina creating a world in her zine about climate change in young people's role in climate change. She created a world without understanding a broad sense of who participates in that world making. And Alan suggested that maybe there's other people who might have a stake in this as well. And it really did impact Gina's whole conception of how she envisions who participates. And it's done without Alan saying, you have to do this. In order to build a better zine, you have to do this. The conversation really did take on this, who's livable, who's able to live here? And that one case study, I think, gives me a lot of encouragement for continuing to think through and practicing peer review, slow peer review. That was a long answer to your question, but I hope that it makes sense, that along the line you kind of get the thinking a little clearer than maybe what's articulated in the documents.
Thank you. It's a good answer. I'm appreciating it. So the next thing I want to ask you about ties into why I asked you to tell us something about yourself, is about relationships. So you posit that kind of a primary aim of slow peer review is building relationships. And in your answer that you just gave right now, I am hearing that these relationships have to do with the relationship between the text and the world, the relationship that is possible in the world that the text imagines. But when I was reading your essays, I was specifically imagining that the process of peer review is about building relationships among the students who are doing the activity, and that this is one of the alternatives to improvement is almost, maybe to make it too reductive, that slow peer review is a classroom community building exercise. Is this part of your thinking? And to tell us more about this, or is this a misreading, or what's happening here?
No, it's not. It's not a misreading, and yes, that's exactly what I'm also trying to do. So what's not in the article, and this is just you and I talking, and whoever's listening. I think that one of the things I love my students, and I love the relationships that we form in our writing classrooms. But I think in my many years of teaching, first year writing, college, in various classrooms, I only keep in touch with a small number of students. And my sense is that those students only keep in touch with a small number of students in our classroom. So it's not like we formed this sustained community that exists outside the accident of a semester in scheduling.
Right.
And so the very notion of a community, I don't think that's what we do in the writing classroom. I think we form contingent or emergent or ethereal bonds with people that dissipate. I can remember two things about my first year writing course that I took in 1999. And one of them was traumatic, and one of them was like, but most of it I've forgotten. What I hope, though, that students kind of can latch onto with slow peer review is an alternative way to relate to texts that are going to be coming at them. And particularly on Facebook, people think that Facebook is, where trolls exist, or that you can't really get a substantive conversation to go on Facebook. But there is this sense of slowing down your response. You can respond to people as a world, as if the post that they created, the tweet that they threw down, was a world-making tweet. And you can challenge the world, and you can respond to the world that was created in any text. And so I want students to go through that process of shifting how they relate to each other when writing is the topic of conversation. And so, yes, it is about that immediate relationship that you could form and providing an alternative to fixing text or improving texts. And that alternative is to talk about what the writing, the effects of the writing. And my thinking is that when we change the way we talk about text, we change the way we relate to each other. And I think that regardless of whether Gina and Alan, as indicated in the pedagogy text, are friends afterwards, it would be really cool if they slow peer reviewed each other, other people's work, right? I've had students go through slow peer review once and then without prompting use slow peer review again next time we did peer review. And that they told me that they have done it in other classes. And so there's a little bit of like contagion, if I could use that. Like if it works and it feels good, and if this kind of experience of engaging slow peer review hits the right spot for you emotionally, there's no reason not to do it elsewhere. But regardless of the enduring effect of Alan and Gina's relationship, or any kind of relationship between any two people during slow peer review, does this feel good enough? Is this pleasurable enough? Is this joyful enough for you to continue to do it in other contexts? And that's kind of the relationship I'm really interested in, is the individual person's relationship to the ways in which they respond to writing. Does that make sense? I like when people like each other, and I like when people have a really good experience in the classroom and treat each other with respect and really learn and grow to love and care for each other. But as a writing teacher, I really am interested in getting you to, or trying to persuade you that your relationship to writing and how you respond to writing can transform, can be done, and can be done without this need to kind of correct or dominate or tear down. That slow peer review replaces a lot of other types of responses. And I try to make a good case for why we should not just slow down, but why we should think about our relationship to drafts and texts and comments and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that our traditional modes of peer review tell us that when someone hands us a draft, this is the kind of relationship that is being invoked. And you're saying, what other kinds of relationship could that kind of scenario invite? Yeah,
that's so much more succinct than what I just said. Thanks, Paul.
So if someone invites me over for a meal, like I'm not going to automatically say, okay, well, how can I give them some feedback on fixing their meal? Right. I mean, that would in fact be considered incredibly rude. Mm-hmm. Not because it is rude. Like if someone actually wanted feedback on their meals, right? It's not inherently bad. It's just, what's the automatic way of relating in that kind of situation?
Yeah. And I just
in this culture, and
yeah, I think it's really important to say that this is an alternative form of response, and I feel like it's also deeply connected to invention. It's not just I feel this way. That there's this process that is creative, not just reactionary. That there's, through the thick description, what I articulate as the thick description, you are inventing a text for someone else then to be accountable to be accountable for. When I hand you a thick description, I'm giving you a moment to account. And rather than check off, oh, how have I accounted? That thick description becomes a rich document that could guide your revision process, but without saying, make sure you account for everything your peer has said. Rather, it's your peer just shared with you their vision of the world. How do you proceed? And how does the way you proceed show up in your draft? So it's the transformation and change, not necessarily the, now go ahead and account for everything that your peer has done. There's sometimes, although it hasn't really occurred in my classes since I've been doing this, where you could imagine a white supremacist or a colorblind, someone who operates on colorblind logic saying, this paper on, that engages race, or, a homophobic student saying, to the queer students paper, like, I hate this, this is awful. Well, there's still a space to account. There's still a space to, what does it mean to proceed in a world without a person like this who exists? And I think the thick description is basically telling students, this exists, this is real. This is a thing that is you're gonna have to confront. Should you choose to confront it now or later? Don't misunderstand the reality of this perspective. And so how do you then transform in light of that realness? Whereas when you go into peer review with an improvement inflected, all you have is, do you correct it or not? And then it gets kicked to the professor. Oh, you've corrected it, or not. But when you think through drafts as participating in worlds with real embodied living people who are responding, I think that's kind of increases the stakes for it all. It actually shows that there's someone who cares about your writing and that there are actual human consequences to your writing. One of the things that students tell me consistently in slow peer review is that they've never had someone ever spend so much time with their draft. And they've never spent so much time with someone's draft. And so that immediately that process of spending time, well, you got to fill it. As a writing instructor, you got to fill it with something, right? And simply finding a thesis statement in a draft can be done relatively quickly, right? And then so I found your thesis. That tells me that you've been able to clearly articulate what your claim is. Now what? Now what do we do? And those things aren't unimportant. It's just they're not considered should an instructor choose to use slow peer review as a method for peer review. And the thing is, I never will ever claim that slow peer review replaces all forms of peer review. There are copy editing stages that, mama, you gotta fix that comma splice. You gotta get your MLA right? And so those kind of reviews can be necessary. But when all you have is improvement inflected peer review, you're missing, I think, the opportunities to really have these kind of experiences that I'm suggesting that slow peer review offers students.
Thank you. I want to frame this next question in terms of maybe imagining the world that is being made by your essays, and I'm especially thinking about your. I don't think it's admittedly difficult. It's admittedly difficult. It's purposefully difficult, right? That's not a bug. That's a feature. You ask hard questions. What are the cultural logics of this text? Write a thick description. Make changes to your draft without anyone having told you what to change. These are really hard things, really valuable things. But what I'm imagining when I read this essay is a classroom in which students are baffled and unable to succeed and are excluded because the task is too hard. So what kinds of, I guess I'm just imagining there's a lot of scaffolding that happens in practice that didn't make it into the essays because you were talking about other things. Yes.
Oh man, you're asking really fantastic questions. I really appreciate this. One of the external reviews of this article before it was printed in 3Cs was, this seems like a really heavy lift. And I say it seems like a really heavy lift. That is a direct, like, hey, I see you, reviewer. This is a really heavy lift. Slow peer review is a really heavy lift. You're right. I think that, no, let me start it this way. A colleague came to me after this article was published, the 3Cs article was published, and said, oh, I'm doing peer review next week. I can't wait to read your article and come up with it. And I thought to myself, this is exactly what I'm saying don't do, right? Peer review scholars know in order for peer review to work well, it has to be taught. You can't just plop it down, that you need to extend it for earlier in the semester, so that whether it's improvement inflected or slow peer review, it's got to be carefully taught. And so in a way, I think slow peer review kind of takes up more space than what normal peer review is traditionally given. And now I'm not talking about like have 3 weeks and then you're going to come up to slow peer review. I'm asking us to, if this is the vision we have for peer review, that we want to integrate slow peer review into our writing classrooms, we got to change our curriculum. Not our curriculum, our course, our pedagogy, or the content of the course even. And I think that those content changes are made because I've thought differently about peer review, not because I want a different peer review practice that fits into the way I already conceptualize my courses. So you're gonna have to talk about cultural logics. And I really, I mean, I'm a fangirl for Krista Ratcliffe's rhetorical listening. I love her work so much. I love that book so much because it gave me language for tropes and it gave me language for cultural logics. She's not the only one to come up with those kind of things, right? Language is tropological is an ancient concept, right? Cultural logics are, have been around for a bit, but the way in which she articulates them really resonated for me. And so I have to spend time with my students talking about tropes and talking about cultural logic. So there are activities and exercises and things like that that I give for helping students to understand that a word does not signify universally. What you think it means is not what it really, doesn't mean that way for other people. And it doesn't have to be about identity politics. It could be like freedom or, Democrats. The word Democrat has multiple different meanings depending on who's using that word. So that kind of exercise and stuff really takes some time. World building, I'm still getting used to, like how, but honestly though, when I say what world has been created in this draft and who can and cannot participate, students do pretty okay with that. With minimal intervention, they could go, okay, I'm reading this, I see that this person would have a really difficult time being a part of it. And they could imagine that. They could kind of think through that. And never once, this is really interesting, never once have I had a student offer a stereotypical perspective. So when 2 questions in slow peer review are who has an easy time living in the world of the draft and who might have a difficult time living in this world. Both answers, I've never gotten a stereotypical response. I've gotten an earnest response from a student trying to figure out, okay, kids are going to be okay in this world. Adults don't exist in this world. And yet they're the policymakers. So what would it mean to account for that? And so even though it may seem hard for writing teachers to ask that kind of question, I've found that just asking the question, students want to try to answer it. And they're wanting to try to answer it often ends up succeeding. And I don't think before this slow peer review stuff, I've never asked students who would have a difficult time living in the draft you just wrote. Like that question never occurred to me until I started thinking through, how do I make sense of this thing? And what seems hard to us is not always hard for them. Now, I'm also the type of teacher that says, please understand the difference between what I'm asking you to do is difficult or you don't know what I'm asking you to do. And so I think that I make that distinction all the time for students, that you may not know the answer to it, but you understand what the question is asking. And if almost all the time students are like, I have no idea how to answer this world question, but I get that he's asking me to. And so there's also this sense of, you ask the right question and students suddenly go, okay, I'm gonna give it a shot. And in the case of Gina and Alan, they gave it a shot. They gave it a shot. And to experience new questions about writing can sometimes do the work that we like do good work just on their own. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good, good.
I want to ask you, I want to reframe your theory a bit, which is I study reading, and so that, I mean, this is framed as a writing pedagogy, and I'm like, no, it's not. This is a reading pedagogy. You have you have the students read the draft 5 times, and your questions like, who can inhabit this world? That is exactly the kind of thing that a literature professor might ask after you read a novel, kind of like as a reading response journal question. So I guess I'm obviously it can be both a reading and a writing pedagogy, but this seems very much you're asking the students to really seriously read each other's drafts, and that this is a reading pedagogy. I wonder what's your reaction to that reading of it.
Yeah, that's okay. So the special issue of Pedagogy, where the article comes out, is edited by Ellen Carrillo and Alice Horning, and they're reading champions. Their work is pretty great about how to bring reading more consciously into rhetoric and composition scholarship. Love their work. And I come at this from a rhetorical listening perspective, and it is a challenge. I think the reading scholars and the reading crew, if I could call you all that, has a legitimate question. And Chris talks about it in rhetorical listening, right? Like, aren't you really just talking about reading? To which Chris says no in the book. I understand the difference, and I could be really wrong because my familiarity with the reading scholarship is just growing, and Alice and Ellen encouraged me to think more about slow peer review and the reading teaching necessarily involved. They were direct in that, like, what does this say about reading, kid? They didn't say it like that. But from my understanding, and please like clap back to this, reading is about comprehension and apprehension of ideas, and listening is reception turned into invention, turned into the practice of creating new texts. And so I'm really interested in how that thick description gets created and what do we need to do in order to create that thick description. I'm really interested in how reception of the thick description plays out into the creation of the author response. And the more research needs to be done with how that author response actually looks in the revision process. Like how does it go from draft to final or final draft? So my sense is, because I'm wedded to like what gets composed, I need to attend to reception and reading and like processing and those kind of things. But ultimately, it feels to me like a writing pedagogy, even though, but ultimately at the end of the day, this is one of those things that I'm really processing in the book project, is where do students get trained in reading drafts this way? And like, what is the, not trained, experience in knowledge and what's the pedagogy of receiving these drafts? I think that there's some good ground here to connect and engage that body of scholarship regarding reading. I don't know, does that answer your question, or am I dancing around it?
Oh, I think it's fascinating. It's a fascinating answer. Yeah. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to frame it. Right. So when you see it as a composing, because you're writing these thick descriptions, and I'm thinking the thick descriptions are readings.
I love it. And this could really just be that, like, there's so much stuff about who are you citing? right? Who are you in bed with? Who are you who are the scholars that are enlivening your world and your way of thinking about things? And for me, it's listening. Now, what does it get us to call one reading and one listening? I don't know yet. What does it get us to keep those kind of scholarships parallel? I'll tell you this, one of my colleagues, I love her to death for this. She keeps encouraging me to get into writing center theory and practice, that there's this whole body of literature that she's convinced, and I'm finding she's right because she's brilliant, Beth Bouquet. It's like, hey, writing center folks are doing some of the similar things. And though the writing center context is really different than the writing classroom context, there's some theorizing going about relationships that, so I think this slow peer review stuff has a lot of really rich potential to speak across these subfields of rhetoric and composition. Luckily, in my institutional context, I don't need the book for tenure and promotion. So I could slow down even a little bit to kind of engage those theories in that body of scholarship. But right now, the conceptions have been, it is, at least in the article, have been without that deep thinking about reading. Although Alice and Ellen really was there's a whole section about in the slow peer review in the writing classroom, there's a paragraph that's talks about type 2 reading. There's that really opened my eyes up, and I'm glad that they pushed me on that because it introduced me to a little bit more to reading scholarship. And as I read the whole special issue, I'm like, there's a relationship here that can be thickened up.
Well, one thing that might be interesting for you to do, which I did in preparing the question with the C's essays, I have a PDF of it, and I did a word search for read, and it appears more times than there are pages in the essay. So that supported my notion. This is really about reading, but these are just kind of multiple lenses to look at. Some really meaningful, what are we doing with these texts? What do these texts have to do with, how do we change the text? How do the text change us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a compelling thing, Paul, to think through, isn't this really about reading? I think that there's a certain dealer's choice, right? and what's really encouraging to me is that their resonance to a subfield of rhetoric and composition, or even teaching pedagogy, that these works are resonating with, and I really appreciate that. And so the larger question is citationality, and who are you citing, who are you situated with, and what would be the consequences of not. Those are interesting scholarly writing questions as a professional writer. You know what I mean? Yeah.
The next thing that I want to ask you about, I think it's probably just a really ignorant question, and so it just kind of shows what I don't know, where I'm coming from. So I guess just to put it bluntly, how is any of this or all of this queer? So I understand clearly that you're citing works, speaking of citationality, from queer theory on world building and world making. But so in addition to, or maybe beyond that academic lineage of some of these concepts, are there or what are the connections between slow peer review and queer folks?
Yeah. That's okay. I've been getting this throughout all of my career. What's queer about any of this? And it has been very difficult for me to pin that down.
Okay.
And I'm not entirely sure why. It could be an intellectual limitation on my part, but the other thing is this is certainly not deep down in the lived experiences of queer people. I'm a queer author, I'm a queer scholar, and this is one queer is thinking through this. And a lot of queer scholarship has been critiqued, especially by queers of color, of white queer theory, of it's too theory, it's too divorced from the lived realities of queer people. And so I'm sensitive to those things. But at the same time, I think the practice of slow peer review is a queer praxis. It's actually, it doesn't matter if you're gay or straight, or if you identify as queer, you're queering drafts. You're queering the writing process in the ways that I think slow peer review asks of you. That it is a tricky way of making queer writers of everyone who does it. And so it's not queer in the identity sense of the word queer, it's queer in the enactment. And one thing that I hold on to is queer enactments are a process of making strange, defamiliarizing people or practices that seem normal, that seems like, well, of course we're going to do this. That slow peer review is strange. And if it becomes something that is widely taken up and people are doing it and creating a bunch of responses to it, there will be needing to be another thing that makes slow peer review strange. It will lose its queerness at some point if this is a field kind of idea. Or it just languishes in obscurity, and that happens too, to more scholars than not. But I'm not interested in, I think that that's right. I think that if you do this, you are writing queerly, you are composing queerly, you are engaging in creating queer relationships of contingency, of accountability and indeterminacy, that there's not a longing for a fixed position in how you should respond to a text, but more exploration of queer things. The questions I'm asking emerge from queer thinking, queer feminist thinking. And so it may not look queer to people who are used to queer rhetoric and composition scholarship talking about an identity, but it is queer in the ways that I think it's very strange and unusual. I think it's very shaking things up. So period. One of my things, and I haven't read all the queer scholarship in rhetoric and composition, but queer often gets elided as a fixed identity. And then there's another perspective about queer. So it goes like, you get the string, the embarrassed, etc., as Judith Butler calls it, right? Where it's like race, class, gender, sexuality, right? Or that LGBTQ, when really you're just talking about gay and lesbian students, right? In the trans issues are even more embarrassing in rhetoric and composition. And there are, Pat Patterson is doing, J.K. Rowson, they're doing wonderful things in rhetoric and composition regarding trans theory and stuff. But queers as that kind of all-inclusive sense, when really you're talking about gay and lesbian students, or really you're talking about homonormativity, to borrow a phrase that Lisa Dugan kind of really pushed into the world. She didn't coin it, I can't remember who did. There's a lot of homonormativity happening in rhetoric and composition, and I wanted to think through a pedagogy that would feel strange, be strange, and allow for a lot of different kind of modes of being, and a lot of different kind of ways to embrace indeterminacy, or a kind of strange non-directive, directive form of peer review. And in some ways then, I want to plug Stacey Waite's Teaching Queer, that it's not about what's good for queer students, it's about queering writing processes. And I think this is part of that. Yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now in thinking about what's queer about this. The other thing, I'm not done. One other thing I would say is I'm a big believer that shaping a very basic classroom practice with queer thinkers does some work of saying to the field, you can take us up. You can take us up. You can't, like, I love the dangerous aspects of queer theory and the like FU notions of queer theory that kind of are designed to be punk rock and kind of, I don't care about your feelings. I really embrace that, but also at the same time, there are other ways of using queer thinkers and scholars in our field that can enliven and enrich our approaches. And so I think that there is something inherently queer about a pedagogy that's animated nearly entirely by queer thinkers. And so whether or not I'm successful as a queer pedagogy or queer writing practice, I'll leave it up to others to decide. I think, though, that it's really important to show rhetoric and composition that when queer theorists are centered and enlivened, there's rich possibility for the things that are central to so many of our teaching practices. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
I have, yeah, what I guess my question kind of said, aside from the citations,
Yeah.
and you're like, well, wait a minute, why? There is no aside about it.
Yeah, it's important. We are in a moment culturally in rhetoric and composition where citational practices, particularly of BIPOC, queers of color, indigenous scholars, our citational practices have to be attended to a greater degree. And not just in our bibliographies, but how do we take that thinking and use it to transform us? So it's not just, oh yeah, I cited Audre Lorde. It's, okay, how does Audre Lorde actually transform the way we approach this? You can't just throw down the master's tools will never do, and just hit it and quit it. There's something much richer about thinking through that concept that a lot of people, that we should be doing. So it's not just citation, but it's thinking with. And sometimes we get that wrong and sometimes we get that right. And when we get it wrong, hopefully that we have space and graciousness and a way to make amends for that, to repair some of the wrong damage that wrong does. But yes, who we cite to get to where we go matters. And it matters that we cite queer people.
Thank you. And I've so enjoyed talking with you, and I really enjoyed these essays, and I'm gonna be thinking about slow peer review, and I'm definitely gonna experiment with it. And I appreciate your caution. That might not be the right word. This is not a strategy. This is a new aim. You're not doing something different. We're not doing something differently. We're doing something different than we had done. So I think the last thing I want to ask you is just, is there anything else that we should talk about while we're here that I haven't asked you about?
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think you did. I've been saying, these questions are really thoughtful and really generative on me. I hope that should slow peer review get taken up, and should people find use in it, I would love to hear how it went, or it didn't go, or that didn't work, or you just created this super idiosyncratic pedagogy that is not transferable to any other person but you. I would love to hear those kind of things. I want people to take this up, and I want people to push, and I open myself up to where it all fell apart, where it went wrong, where I may have misunderstood something or overstated my case. I mean, I'm excited to have my first C's article be this, but in that excitement to get it out, sometimes there's things that are like, ooh, and I don't know what those are necessarily because I'm so in it. So I welcome those kind of things, and hopefully that they're generously framed so that we can form relationships, you know? That's what I hope.
You want folks to respond slowly.
Yes.
Well, may it be so. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And so long.